My name is Lyra Vance. In a family that built its empire on the loud, the flashy, and the relentless noise of 24-hour news cycles, I was the static. I was born into the Vance Media Group, a dynasty of silver-tongued orators and cutthroat anchors, but I was born with a glitch, a stutter. To my father, Silas Vance, I wasn't a daughter. I was a defective product, a PR liability that needed to be hidden in the dark corners of our limestone mansion. They called me Quiet Lyra, not out of affection, but as a directive. My siblings mocked the way my breath caught on the letter B, or how I tripped over my own name. They locked me out of the boardroom and kept me away from the microphones, telling me that a girl who couldn't finish a sentence had no business in a family that owned the airwaves. They thought they had muted me forever. They didn't realize that when you can't speak, you learn to listen, and when you finally find your voice, it carries the weight of every silent year behind it. Today, I am the siren, the most influential voice in the country, and today the man who told me I was a stuttering embarrassment is waiting in my lobby, begging for a single minute of my time. The dinner table at the Vance estate was never a place for conversation. It was a stage for conquest. My father, Silas, sat at the head, his voice a baritone boom that felt like it could shake the very foundations of the house. To his left sat my brother, Julian, a rising star in political commentary, and to his right, my sister, Serena, who ran our lifestyle magazine empire with a heart of tempered ice. I sat at the far end, near the swinging door to the kitchen. I was 19, and I was invisible. "The merger with Global Stream is finalized," Silas announced, swirling a vintage Bordeaux. "It's a new era for Vance Media. We control the narrative from the coast to the capital. Julian, you'll lead the evening briefing. Serena, you have the digital cover." He paused, his sharp, hawk-like eyes drifting down the long table until they landed on me. I felt my throat tighten, the familiar phantom of a knot forming behind my vocal cords. "And Lyra," he said, his tone shifting from pride to a weary, biting condescension, "you will continue your studies in the archives. I've had the staff move a desk into the basement levels. It's quieter there. Less chance of you being cornered by a journalist. We can't have the heiress of a media empire struggling to give her own name to the press. It's bad for the stock price." "Father," I began, my lungs hitching. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. I want to work in the radio division. I have ideas for the podcast." Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Radio, Lyra, really? You'd be a comedy act, the stuttering hour. We'd lose half the audience just waiting for you to get through the intro." "Julian's right, darling," Serena added, delicately patting her lips with a silk napkin. "It's about brand consistency. The Vance brand is clarity, it's authority. You are more of a behind-the-scenes personality, deep behind the scenes. In fact, if you could just stay in the archives permanently, it would save us all a lot of awkwardness." I looked at my plate. The words were there, screaming in my head, perfectly formed and brilliant, but they were trapped behind a wall of spasming muscle. I was a prisoner in a house built of glass and microphones. "Enough," Silas snapped. "The decision is made. You are a Vance by blood, Lyra, but you are not a Vance by voice. Accept your limitations. It's the only way you'll find any peace." I left the table before the dessert was served. I walked through the echoing halls of the mansion, past the portraits of my ancestors, men and women who had moved nations with their speeches. I went to the one place I felt safe, the old broadcast room in the attic, a relic from the 1940s when my grandfather started the business with a single shortwave transmitter. I put on the heavy vintage headphones. I flipped the switch on the ancient tube amplifier. The warm, amber glow filled the dark room. I pulled the heavy ribbon microphone toward me. My name is Lyra," I whispered into the dark. The stutter was a jagged knife, cutting my identity into pieces. I hated it. I hated the pity in the servants' eyes and the disgust in my father's. But most of all, I hated the silence they forced upon me. That night, I didn't sleep. I found a box of old elocution tapes in the attic, dusty reels of a woman's voice from the 1950s, teaching the art of the perfect breath. I put the first reel on the player. "Breath is the soul of speech," the voice crackled. "Control the air and you control the world." I spent the next 3 years in a self-imposed exile. To my family, I was the defective daughter who spent her days in the dusty silence of the archives. They forgot I existed. They sent me a monthly allowance to stay out of sight, and I used every cent of it. Not on clothes or cars or social climbing. I spent it on a secret clinic in the mountains of Switzerland, specialized in neurological speech patterns. I spent it on vocal coaches who worked in the shadows. I spent it on a high-end portable recording studio that I hid in my basement apartment. But more than that, I spent it on listening. I listened to the way people talked when they thought no one was watching. I listened to the cadence of heartbreak, the rhythm of anger, and the melody of hope. I realized that my family's media empire was failing not because of technology, but because they had stopped listening. They were all broadcast, no reception. One night, 4 years after that dinner, I sat in my small apartment. I had spent 6 months in total silence, a vocal fast prescribed by my mentor. My throat felt different. My mind felt clear. I opened a laptop and started a stream. I didn't use the Vance name. I didn't use a video feed. I used a high-quality filter to deepen my tone just enough to be unrecognizable. I called the show Midnight Static. I leaned into the microphone. I took a deep, controlled breath, the way the woman on the tape had taught me. I felt the air fill my lungs, steady and calm. "Good evening, world," I said. The words didn't trip, they didn't catch, they flowed like honey over velvet. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, my own voice freed from the cage. I continued, "My name is the Siren, and for the next hour I am going to tell you the truths that the news won't. I am going to tell you what happens when the lights go out and the powerful think they're alone. Tonight, we talk about the silence." I talked for 60 minutes. I shared stories of the invisible people I had met in the archives, the scandals my father had buried, and the raw, unfiltered reality of life outside the Vance bubble. The first night, 10 people listened. A week later, 1,000. A month later, Midnight Static was the most downloaded podcast in the country. People were obsessed. Who was she? Where did she come from? The voice was hypnotic, authoritative, and utterly anonymous. Back at the Vance mansion, the panic was setting in. Their ratings were plummeting. The Vance authority was being dismantled by a shadow. "We need to find this siren," Silas roared during a board meeting I was forced to attend as a silent observer. He looked older now, his face etched with the stress of a dying empire. "Julian, use your contacts. Serena, find out which studio she's using. I want her silenced." I sat in the corner, a notebook in my lap, my head bowed. I looked like the same quiet Lyra they had always known. I felt a surge of electric joy. They were looking for a monster in the dark, never realizing she was sitting at their table taking notes. Luck with that," I whispered, intentionally tripping over the L. "Shut up, Lyra," Julian snapped, not even looking at me. I smiled to myself. They had no idea. The adults were talking into microphones that were slowly being unplugged, and the girl they mocked was about to turn the volume up to maximum. The war for the airwaves had begun, and for the first time in history, the Vances were about to find out what happens when the static starts to scream. The red on-air light in my private studio felt like a beating heart in the darkness. I leaned into the microphone, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat rising in my chest. For the world, I was a ghost. For my family, I was a shadow. But in this small, soundproofed room, I was the only thing that felt real. My voice didn't catch on the syllables. My breath didn't hitch. I wasn't the defective Vance daughter here. I was the architect of their anxiety. "Tonight," I said, my voice a smooth, low-frequency vibration that resonated in the listener's eardrums, "we talk about the price of prestige. We talk about the Vance Media Group's latest exclusive, the one they bought with a bribe and wrapped in a lie. Why is the truth so expensive? And why is silence the only thing they give for free?" I watched the live metrics on my monitor. 400,000 concurrent listeners. The chat was a blur of theories and praise. But one message stood out, highlighted in gold. It was a verified handle, Julian Vance Official. "Siren," the message read, "you hide behind a filter and a fake name. If you have the courage of your convictions, join me on the Vantage Point tomorrow night. Let's see if your voice holds up when I'm the one asking the questions." I smiled, a slow, predatory curve of my lips. Julian was desperate. My ratings had overtaken his primetime slot for 3 weeks running. Advertisers were pulling out of Vance Media to find the Siren's shadow network. They were tired of the polished lies. They wanted the raw static of the truth. I leaned closer to the mic, letting my breath hitch just slightly, a controlled, artistic pause that mimicked my old weakness but carried a new power. "Julian Vance," I whispered, "the man who thinks the world is his teleprompter. You want an interview? I'll give you something better. I'll give you a lesson, but we do it on my terms, my frequency, my time. Thursday at midnight, you come to my digital bridge or you stay in your ivory tower. The choice is yours, golden boy." I cut the feed. The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, the Vance Tower was a hive of frantic energy. I walked through the lobby clutching a stack of archival reports that were actually just blank pages I used as props to maintain my cover. "Lyra, move it," Serena hissed as she brushed past me, her silk dress rustling like a snake. She was on the phone, her voice shrill and commanding. "I don't care what it costs. Find out where that broadcast is originating from. If Julian fumbles this interview, our stock will hit the floor. We can't let a faceless voice dictate our market value." I stepped into the elevator, my eyes fixed on the floor. Julian was already inside, staring at his reflection in the polished brass walls. He looked exhausted. His perfectly coiffed hair was slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of studio makeup could hide. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. Did you see the news, Julian?" I stammered, my voice small and shaky, playing the part perfectly. He didn't even look at me. "Not now, Lyra. I have a real problem to deal with. Some anonymous coward thinks she can take me down. She's probably some failed theater student with a voice changer. I'm going to tear her apart on Thursday. I'm going to show the world that there is only one true voice in this city, and it belongs to the Vances." "You look nervous," I whispered, barely audible. Julian turned to me, his eyes flaring with sudden, sharp anger. "Nervous? I'm a Vance. I own the air. You wouldn't understand, Lyra. You can barely get through a lunch order without choking on your own tongue. Just go back to your basement and count your dusty boxes. Leave the broadcast world to people who can actually speak." The elevator doors opened. I watched him stride out, his arrogance a suit of armor with a massive, invisible crack in the chest. I spent the rest of the day in the archives, but I wasn't filing papers. I was using the Vance's own high-speed internal servers, which they had never bothered to secure against the harmless daughter, to map Julian's private communications.
They underestimated me so thoroughly that they left the keys to the kingdom in the hands of the girl they called Quiet Lyra. I found exactly what I was looking for, a series of emails between Julian and a local politician discussing the suppression of a lead poisoning story in the city's lower income districts. It was a classic Vance move: protect the donors, bury the victims. Julian had traded children's health for a seat at the governor's table. Thursday arrived like a storm front. I prepared my studio with surgical precision. I didn't use a voice changer to hide my identity. I used vocal placement. I pitched my voice from the diaphragm, adding a smoky, authoritative texture that was miles away from the high-pitched, stuttering breathiness I used in the Vance mansion. I was no longer a victim of my vocal cords. I was their master. Midnight struck. The vantage point was patched into my stream. Millions of people were tuned in, including, I knew, my father in his darkened study, watching his empire's future hang in balance. "Tonight," I said, my voice a velvet hammer, "Julian Vance. Enough with the theatrics, siren. You've spent months attacking my family's integrity. You claim to be a champion of the people, but you're just a ghost. Why don't you show your face? Or are you as ugly as your accusations?" "My face isn't the one on the most wanted list of truth seekers, Julian," I replied calmly. "Let's talk about the Clearwater Initiative. You told your audience it was a triumph for the city, but my sources say you were CC'd on a report 3 months ago stating the water was toxic. Why did you kill that story, Julian? Was the Vance Authority for sale, or was it just a gift for your friends at the Capitol?" There was a long, agonizing silence. I could almost hear Julian's heart hammering through the digital connection. He wasn't prepared for specifics. He was prepared for a debate, but I was presenting an audit. That's a lie," he stammered. For a split second, he sounded exactly like the old version of me. The irony was poetic. "Is it? I'm uploading the email thread to the live chat right now. Check the headers, Julian. Your private address, your signature, your silence. The world can see your fingerprints on every poisoned pipe in this city." The chat erupted. Julian started to speak, but the words were caught in his throat. He was gasping, the sound of a man drowning in his own lies on live radio. "Tonight's lesson," I told the millions of listeners, my voice firm and unshakable. "The loudest voice in the room is often the hollow. When the truth finally speaks, it doesn't need to shout. Sleep well, Vance Media. The static is only getting louder, and the signal is only getting clearer." I turned off the mic. I went back to the Vance mansion. I slipped through the servants' entrance. In the kitchen, my father was sitting in the dark, staring at a static-filled television screen. He looked older than I had ever seen him. "Julian is finished," he whispered, not even looking up as I entered. That woman, she destroyed 30 years of branding in 10 minutes. She knew things only a ghost could know. Someone in our house is leaking, Lyra. Someone is talking. Go to bed, Lyra. At least you're too quiet to cause this kind of trouble. You're the only one I can trust not to betray me. I walked up the stairs, my heels clicking softly on the marble. I wasn't just quiet Lyra anymore. I was the siren, and I was just getting started on the playlist for their funeral. The airwaves were finally beginning to breathe.
The silence in the Vance mansion the morning after Julian's broadcast was heavy, like the air in a tomb. My father didn't come down for breakfast. Serena stayed locked in her office, her voice muffled as she screamed at her PR team through the mahogany door. I sat in the breakfast nook, slowly stirring a cup of tea, watching the sunlight play across the silver spoons. To anyone looking, I was just Lyra, the girl who struggled to ask for more sugar. Inside, I was calculating the exact frequency needed to shatter the rest of the glass. "Lyra,
Get in here! Silas's voice roared from the study. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked into the lion's den. My father was hunched over his desk, surrounded by printed transcripts of my broadcast. His face was a sickly shade of gray. Julian sat in a leather armchair, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. What's wrong, father? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The siren. Silas spat the name like it was poison. She didn't just leak those emails, Lyra. She started a movement. There's a protest forming outside the Clearwater Municipal Building. The advertisers are jumping ship like rats. We've lost 3 major sponsors in 6 hours. If we don't identify her and shut her down, this company won't survive the quarter. I'm sure Julian can fix it, I said, looking at my brother. Julian didn't even flinch. I can't fix a ghost, Lyra. She has no digital footprint. Her encryption is military grade. It's almost as if she's broadcasting from inside our own walls. He looked up, his eyes momentarily narrowing as they swept over me. Then he shook his head, dismissing the thought before it could even form. To him, the idea of me having a military-grade thought was a joke. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Friday, Silas announced, ignoring my presence again. We need to rebrand. We need a new face, someone who represents vulnerability and transparency. We'll feed the public a sacrificial lamb to distract them from the lead poisoning scandal. Who? Serena asked, stepping into the room, her eyes sharp. Silas looked at me. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, the look of a man who had found a way to use a broken tool one last time. Lyra, he said, we'll put her on camera, the silent daughter. We'll script a heartfelt apology about how the family was distracted by her health issues, but how she's been the conscience of the Vances all along. The public loves a tragic figure. Her stutter will make them pity us instead of hating us. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of dull confusion. Me? On camera? Julian said I'm a comedy act. Julian was wrong, Silas said, walking over and placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt like a shackle. You're an asset now, Lyra. You'll say exactly what we write for you. You'll look at the lens, you'll struggle through your lines, and you'll make this city forgive us. It's the only way you'll ever be worth the air you breathe in this house. I looked down, hiding the cold, sharp glint in my eyes. I'll do my best, Father. That night, I didn't go to my Swiss clinic or my secret studio. I stayed in the mansion, in the very archives they had banished me to. I spent the night downloading the encrypted files Silas used to manage his black ledger, the real accounts that showed exactly where the money went from the suppressed stories. Offshore accounts, bribes to environmental inspectors, and donations to the very judges who dismissed the Clearwater lawsuits. The sacrificial lamb was about to grow teeth. I sat at my desk in the basement, the glow of the monitor reflected in my glasses. I opened my recording software. I didn't need a broadcast tonight. I needed a payload. I recorded a 10-minute segment, but I didn't use the voice of the siren. I used my natural, clear voice, the voice Silas had never heard. It was clear, cutting, and filled with the resonance of 20 years of suppressed rage. Friday morning, I whispered into the mic. The Vance Media Group will attempt to use a defective daughter to mask their crimes. They think silence is a weakness. They're about to learn that silence is just a long-term investment in a very loud explosion. I set the file to auto-upload to every major news outlet and social media platform the moment my father's live apology went on air. Friday arrived. The main studio was a forest of lights and cameras. I was dressed in a soft, pale pink dress designed to make me look younger and more fragile. A makeup artist had added a touch of redness under my eyes to simulate exhausting. Silas stood behind the camera, a teleprompter glowing with the lies he had written for me. "Remember, Lyra," Silas whispered as the floor manager counted down. 3, 2, 1. We're live. The red light flickered on. The world was watching. Silas gestured for me to begin. I looked into the lens. I saw my reflection in the glass. I didn't look at the teleprompter. I didn't trip over the letter B. I didn't hitch my breath. "Good morning, citizens of this city," I said. My voice was a clarion call, vibrating through the studio with a power that made the cameraman stumble. It wasn't the siren's smoky hum. It was Lyra Vance, standing in the light. "My father wants me to tell you a story about a family that was distracted, but I'm here to tell you a story about a family that was calculated." Silas's face went from confusion to a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He started waving his arms, screaming for the technicians to cut the feed. "The feed is locked, Father," I said, turning my head slightly towards him, my voice never wavering. "I bypassed the master control an hour ago. You wanted the world to see the silent daughter? Well, look at me. I'm not stuttering anymore, and I have a lot to say about the Clearwater reports." I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and held it up to the camera. "Everything Silas Vance wanted to bury is currently being uploaded to every server in the country. The silence is officially over." The studio was in chaos. Security guards were rushing towards me, but I didn't move. I stood my ground, the light of the cameras burning into me like a coronation. Julian was frozen in the corner, his mouth agape. Serena was frantically trying to get a signal on her phone, but I had jammed the local towers. "The frequency is mine now," I told the lens. In that moment, I wasn't the ghost in the basement or the voice in the dark. I was the person who had finally, truly broken the glass. And as Silas Vance collapsed into his chair, realizing he had just handed the microphone to his own executioner, I felt the most profound peace I had ever known. The static was gone, the signal was perfect, and the world was finally listening.
The board meeting for Vance Media Group felt more like a funeral procession. The mahogany table, once a symbol of absolute power, was now cluttered with bankruptcy warnings and termination notices from long-term advertisers. Silas sat at the head, his eyes sunken and his skin the color of old parchment. Julian was absent, hiding in a private rehab facility to recover from the stress, while Serena frantically tapped at her phone, trying to sell off her magazine's assets before the shares hit zero. I sat in my usual corner, the silent observer with the dusty archives in my head. I wasn't just filing papers anymore. I was filing the death certificates of their careers. "We have one option left," Silas whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "The siren. Her audience is now larger than our entire network combined. If we can get her to endorse our new transparency initiative, the markets might stabilize. We need to buy her. Everyone has a price, especially someone hiding in a basement." "She doesn't want money, Father," Serena snapped, looking up from her screen. "She wants blood. She's already leaked me audit reports from the offshore accounts. She's not an activist, she's an executioner." "Then we appeal to her ego," Silas said, slamming his fist feebly on the table. "Offer her a seat on the board. Offer her a prime-time slot with no editorial oversight. Lyra, get me the private line for the Midnight Static production team. You've been monitoring the archives. Find out who handles her legal representation." I'll try, Father," I said, my voice trembling with the perfect amount of feigned effort.
That night, I didn't broadcast a scandal. I didn't leak a document. I waited for the private line in my studio to ring. I knew it would. Silas was a man who believed enough gold could mute any truth. When the light flashed, I took a slow, deep breath, centering my voice in that rich, velvety place that commanded the airwaves. "You're late, Silas," I said, the filter giving my voice a haunting, metallic edge. "Siren," Silas's voice came through, surprisingly humble. "I won't waste your time. You've made your point. You've wounded us. But a dead empire benefits no one. I'm offering you a partnership, total creative freedom, a 10% stake in Vance Media, and the resources of a global infrastructure. Join us and we can change the world together." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the silent archives through the glass of my studio. "You want to change the world, Silas? Or do you just want to change the subject? You're not offering me a partnership. You're offering me a cage with gold bars. You think because I'm a voice, I don't have a face. You think because I hide, I'm afraid." "I'm offering you a legacy," Silas shouted, his desperation breaking through the veneer of professionalism. "Without me, you're just a ghost in the machine. With me, you're the queen of media. Think about your future." "My future is already written, Silas, and it doesn't include you. But I'll tell you what, I'll give you a chance to save the company. One interview, live, in my studio. No teleprompters, no scripted questions. You come here, you tell the truth about Clearwater, and I'll consider the partnership." "Where is the studio?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of hope and dread. "I'll send a car. Friday night, midnight. Come alone, Silas. If I see a single PR handler or a lawyer, the deal is off, and I release the tax records for your 2018 acquisitions." I hung up. The next day at the mansion was surreal. Silas was almost cheerful. He treated me with a strange, distracted kindness, as if I were a lucky charm. He even asked the chef to prepare my favorite meal. He thought he was about to win. He thought he could charm the siren just like he had charmed the masses for 40 years. "Everything is going to be fine, Lyra," he said, patting my hand at dinner. "A big move is coming. Soon the Vance name will be respected again. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find a place for you in the new company, something in the library department where it's quiet." "Thank you, Father," I said, smiling softly. I hope the siren is kind to you." "Kindness has nothing to do with it, child. It's all about the deal." Friday night arrived. I watched from the attic window as a black sedan pulled into the driveway to collect my father. He looked regal in his charcoal suit, a man going to reclaim his throne. As the car pulled away, I went to my room, changed into a sleek black dress, and took the hidden staircase to the basement. The studio was ready. I sat behind the console, the monitors glowing with the silhouettes of the millions who were waiting for the interview of the century. Silas was led into the soundproof room by my masked assistant. He looked around the small, dark space, his eyes landing on the one-way glass that separated us. He couldn't see me, but I could see every bead of sweat on his forehead. "Sit down, Silas," I said, my voice filling the room, echoing with an authority that made him flinch. "The microphones are hot. The world is listening. Tell me, Silas, when you stood over the hospital beds in the lower districts and promised those families you'd find the cause of the lead poisoning, did you already have the check from the construction company in your pocket?" Silas blinked, the bright studio lights making him squint. He tried to find the camera, tried to find the persona he had practiced. That's a complex question, Siren. The economy of a city requires balance. Stop, I interrupted, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor. No balance, no economics, just the truth. Did you trade those children's futures for a skyscraper? I did what was necessary for the survival of the firm, Silas suddenly roared, his temper finally snapping. You judge me from your dark corner, but you don't know what it's like to carry the weight of thousands of employees. I am Silas Vance. I built this city. You didn't build it, Silas. You just rented the microphones to drown out the screams of the people who did. I reached for the controls. I didn't cut the feed. I did something much more permanent. I turned off the voice filter. I let the smoke and the metallic hum fade away. I spoke with the voice I had used every morning at his breakfast table. Is that your final answer, Father? Silas froze. The silence in the studio was absolute. He stared at the glass, his mouth opening and closing like fish out of water. He recognized the tone. He recognized the cadence. He recognized the soul behind the words. Lyra, he whispered, his voice trembling with a terror that no bankruptcy could ever cause. No, it can't be. You can't even speak. I've been speaking for years, Father. You just weren't listening. You were too busy waiting for me to trip over my own name to realize I was spelling out your ending. I stood up and walked to the door of the studio. I opened it and stepped into the light. Silas looked at me, and for the first time in my life, he didn't see a liability. He saw his successor, and he knew in that cold, bright moment that the quiet daughter was the one who was going to turn off the lights on his world forever. The frequency is closed, Silas, and so is your account. I walked out, leaving him alone in the booth, the red light still glowing, a permanent record of his defeat.
The transition from the shadow to the spotlight was not a graceful walk. It was a tactical insertion. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, I had moved my primary servers into the heart of the Vance Tower, occupying the top floor that once belonged to my father's executive committee. I replaced the mahogany and velvet with sleek glass and open-source hardware. The siren was no longer a ghost in a basement. She was the CEO of a new era. But my father was not a man who died quietly. He was a man who lit the house on fire before leaving it. "You've been served, Miss Vance," a process server muttered as I exited the elevator on Monday morning. He looked terrified, avoiding my eyes as he handed me a thick envelope embossed with the seal of the Supreme Court. I opened it in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by the journalists who now hung on my every word. It was a petition for guardianship. Silas and Julian were claiming that my years of silence and neurological speech impediments were symptoms of a deeper cognitive collapse. They were arguing that my persona as the siren was a manifestation of a split personality, and that I was legally unfit to manage the Vance estate. "They're trying to lobotomize your career, Lyra," my lead counsel, Sarah, said as we sat in the new boardroom. "They've hired Dr. Eris Thorne, the most expensive forensic psychiatrist in the country. He's prepared to testify that my sudden cure is a high-functioning manic episode." "Let them try," I said, my voice steady, a calm lake after a lifetime of storms. "They think my stutter was a broken gear in a machine. They don't realize it was a cocoon. They want to use my history against me? Fine, we'll give them a history lesson." The courtroom a week later was a circus. Silas sat behind his legal team, looking regained and sharp, as if the shame of the broadcast had never happened. He had traded his despair for a cold, clinical aggression.
Julian sat beside him, looking recovered, playing the role of the concerned brother to perfection for the cameras. "Dr. Thorne," Silas's lead attorney began, "in your professional opinion, is it common for a lifelong, severe stutterer to suddenly possess the oratorical skills of a world-class broadcaster without significant psychiatric intervention?" "It is highly irregular," the doctor droned, looking at me with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. "Such a shift often indicates a dissociative break. The patient creates a stronger persona to cope with the trauma of their perceived inadequacy. In Ms. Vance's case, the siren isn't a career, it's a symptom. She is currently in a state of hyper-fixated grandiosity. She is a danger to the assets of the company because she is not grounded in her own reality." I watched Silas. He was smirking. He thought he had found a way to put me back in the basement, this time with a medical seal on the door. "Ms. Vance," the judge said, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, "do you wish to testify in your own defense? I must warn you, the medical testimony is quite compelling." I stood up. I didn't look at the judge. I looked at Silas. I didn't use the smoky, deep resonance of the siren. I used the voice of the girl who used to sit at his table, but without the hitch. "Your Honor," I began, the room falling into a hush so deep you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "For 20 years, my father told me that my silence was a void. He told me that because I couldn't speak his language of lies, I had no thoughts of my own. He confused my struggle with a lack of substance. Dr. Thorne calls my voice a symptom. I call it a choice." "A choice?" the opposing attorney scoffed. "You chose to stutter for 20 years?" "I chose to listen," I replied, my voice gaining a rhythmic, percussive power. "I chose to wait until I had something worth saying. The Vances have spent 40 years filling the air with noise. I spent 20 years filling my mind with the truth. My father didn't lose his company because I'm manic. He lost it because I am the only person in this family who actually knows how to communicate with the world without a script." I walked to the witness stand, pulling a small digital recorder from my pocket. "Dr. Thorne talks about dissociative breaks. Let's listen to a recording from 3 years ago. This is a private conversation between Silas and Julian in the Vance archives, where they thought I was too defective to understand what they were saying." I pressed play. Silas's voice filled the courtroom, cold and mocking. "Don't worry about the girl, Julian. She's a blank slate. We'll use her trust fund to cover the Clearwater settlements. She won't say a word. She can't even say her own name without breaking into a sweat. She's the perfect ghost." The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel, his face turning a deep shade of red. Silas leapt to his feet, his composure shattering. "That was a private conversation. It's inadmissible," he screamed. "It's evidence of a conspiracy to defraud a beneficiary, Silas," I said, my voice cutting through his shouting like a diamond through glass. "You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a silent bank account. You didn't care about my neurological state when you were spending my inheritance to hide your crimes. You only care now because the ghost has started to haunt you." I turned back to the judge. "I am not a split personality. I am a woman who was silenced by her environment and liberated by her own will. If being able to speak the truth after a lifetime of lies is a symptom of insanity, then this entire city needs a psychiatrist." The judge looked at the medical reports, then at Silas, who was currently being restrained by his own lawyers. He looked at me, calm, articulate, and utterly unshakable. "Petition denied," the judge stated, the sound of the gavel feeling like a thunderclap. "Furthermore, I am referring the contents of that recording to the district attorney for an investigation into fiduciary fraud. This court is adjourned." As the room cleared, I stayed in my seat. Silas was being led out, his eyes burning with a hatred that would have withered me a year ago. Now it was just static. Julian tried to approach me, his hand outstretched in a pathetic attempt at reconciliation. "Lyra, listen, we were just trying to—" "Don't, Julian," I said, not even looking up as I gathered my papers. "The adults are done talking. You should go find a mirror, see if there's anything left of you that isn't a Vance Media branding package." I walked out of the courtroom and into the bright afternoon sun. The press was waiting, a sea of microphones reaching for me like hungry birds. I didn't hide. I didn't trip. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, pure, clear, and free. "The truth doesn't need a guardian," I told the cameras. "It just needs a frequency." I went back to the tower. There were more files to leak, more stories to tell, and a legacy to burn to the ground so that something real could grow in its place. The Vances owned the air for far too long. It was time to give it back to the people who actually had something to say.
The executive suite of the tower had changed. The heavy velvet curtains that used to block the sun were gone, replaced by smart glass that adjusted to the natural light of the city. The air didn't smell like expensive cigars and stale secrets anymore. It smelled like ozone and fresh coffee. I sat at the glass desk, reviewing the acquisition papers for the last of my father's regional radio stations. The Vance Media Group was officially a hollow shell, a ghost ship drifting in a sea of debt. "Miss Vance," my assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your father is in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment, and he's refusing to leave until he speaks with the architect of his ruin." I leaned back, looking at the city skyline. I could see the Clearwater district from here, the cranes finally moving in to replace the poisoned pipes. "Send him up, and tell security to stand down. He's not a threat anymore. He's a lesson." When the doors opened, Silas didn't storm in. He shuffled. His suit, once a tailored armor, looked a size too big for his shrinking frame. He looked at the open-plan office, at the young developers and journalists who didn't even look up as he passed. He was a relic in his own kingdom. "Lyra," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't call me Quiet Lyra. He didn't even use my name with the old condescension. He sounded like a man drowning. "Sit down, Silas." I gestured to the chair across from me. "I assume you're not here to discuss my neurological state again." "The banks called this morning," he said, ignoring the jab. "They're seizing the mansion, the art, the archives, even your mother's piano. It's all going to auction. Julian has disappeared to Europe with what's left of his trust fund, and Serena is trying to pivot into reality television. I have nothing, Lyra. 30 years of building, and I'm left with a suitcase and a reputation that is radioactive." "You didn't build a reputation, Silas. You built a facade," I replied, my voice calm and clinical. "A facade requires constant maintenance. You stopped paying the bill when you started lying to the people who kept the lights on." "I need an airwave, Lyra." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a desperate, pathetic fire. "One broadcast, a farewell address. I need to explain the context of the Clearwater decisions. I need the world to understand that I wasn't a monster. I was a businessman making impossible choices. If I can just speak to the people one last time, on your platform, with your reach, I can save what's left of the family name." I looked at him, the man who had mocked my stutter, who had hidden me in basements, who had tried to have me declared insane just to protect his offshore accounts. He was asking for the very thing he'd denied me for 20 years, a voice. "You want me to give you a microphone?" I asked, a cold irony curling around the words. "The man who told me I was a PR liability wants to use my vulnerability brand to polish his image." "You're my father," he barked, a flash of his old arrogance flickering out before dying out. "I gave you everything, the education, the doctors, the roof over your head.
I owe you at least the chance to defend myself. I owe you nothing but the truth, Silas, and the truth is, you don't want to defend yourself. You want to rewrite history. You want to use the siren's credibility to wash the blood off your hands. But my frequency doesn't work that way. It doesn't filter out the inconvenient facts. I stood up and walked to the window. I'll give you your broadcast. Tomorrow night, prime time. But it's not a farewell address. It's a live Q&A, and I'm the one asking the questions. No scripts, no pre-approved topics. You face the music, or you face the auction block alone. Silas looked at the floor. He knew it was a trap. He knew I would dismantle him line by line. But he was a narcissist. He believed his own voice was his greatest weapon. He believed that if he could just get the world to listen, he could win them back. "Fine," he whispered. "Tomorrow night, but I want your word. No voice modulators, no digital tricks. I want to look my daughter in the eye while I speak to the world. You'll see me, Silas. I promise you that." The next night, the studio was packed with a skeleton crew. The tension was thick as a knife. Silas sat in the guest chair, adjusted his tie, and cleared his throat. He looked at the camera with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime in the glow of the red light. "We are live in 5, 4, 3. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing through the studio, clear and resonant. "Tonight, we have a special guest, the man who defined the old world of media, Silas Vance. He's here to offer his context on the events that led to the collapse of his empire. Silas, the floor is yours." Silas turned to the lens, his face softening into a mask of fatherly regret. "To the citizens of this city, I want to say that I have always acted with the best intentions. Let's start with the bribes, Silas. The $3 million transferred to the Environmental Board the day before the Clearwater report was suppressed. Was that an intention or a transaction?" Silas's smile faltered. "That was a legal donation to—" "I have the ledger right here, Father, and the sworn testimony of the board's treasurer. He says you threatened to ruin his family if he didn't take the money. Is that the Vance authority at work?" The interview lasted 2 hours. It wasn't a conversation. It was an autopsy. Every time Silas tried to pivot to a grand narrative of hard choices, I brought him back to a specific victim, a specific dollar amount, a specific lie. I used the very skills he taught me, precision, timing, and the power of the pause, to strip him bare. By the end, Silas wasn't the regal media mogul anymore. He was a broken old man, sweating under the lights, his hands trembling as he realized that no one was buying the mask. The live comments on the screen were a tidal wave of fury. He had come to save his name, and instead he had cemented his infamy. "I did it for the family," he whimpered as the cameras cut to a commercial break. "No, Silas," I said, taking off my headset and looking at him with a pity that was far worse than any anger. "You did it for the noise. You were so afraid of the silence that you filled it with a monster, and now the monster is all that's left." I walked out of the studio, leaving him sitting in the dark as the crew began to break down the sets. He had his one last broadcast. He had his voice, and it had finally told the only story he could never run from, his own. The airwaves were clean, the static was gone, and for the first time in my life, when I spoke, I didn't just hear my own voice, I heard the city finally starting to speak back.
The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Plaza was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the relentless flash of paparazzi cameras. This was the National Media Forum, the night where the industry crowned its new sovereign. I stood backstage, wearing a dress of midnight blue that felt like armor. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman whose eyes no longer searched for approval, but for the truth. In an hour, I was to receive the Voice of the Year award, the very trophy Silas had won 5 times.
But as I adjusted my earpiece, a familiar, sharp scent of expensive perfume filled the cramped dressing room. Serena stood in the doorway, her smile a jagged line of porcelain and spite. "You look almost like one of us, Lyra," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Her magazine empire was gone, her assets frozen, but her arrogance remained untouched. "The hair, the dress, the speech, it's a wonderful performance, but we both know that under that expensive silk, you're still the girl who can't say hello without a struggle." "The world seems to disagree, Serena," I replied, my voice calm and resonant. "And the world is currently waiting for me, not you. Why are you here? To ask for a loan or to offer a confession?" "I'm here to watch the curtain fall," she whispered, her eyes flashing with a manic light. "You think you've won because you have the tower, but the Vance name belongs to the loud, not the broken. Enjoy your moment, siren. It's going to be a very short one." She vanished into the shadows of the wings before I could respond. I felt a cold prickle of intuition. Serena was never for empty threats. She was a tactician of social slaughter. I walked onto the stage to a standing ovation that felt like a physical wave. Thousands of people, the very people who had once ignored me at my father's parties, were now cheering for the woman who had dismantled the Vance dynasty. I reached the podium, the golden trophy cool beneath my palm. "Tonight is not about a person. It is about the end of the era of the monologue. For too long the airwaves were a one-way street." Suddenly, the speakers let out a deafening, high-pitched squeal. The giant screens behind me flickered, turning from my portrait to a grainy, distorted video feed. The audience gasped. It was a recording from the Swiss clinic 3 years ago. It showed me in a therapy room, my face contorted in frustration, my chest heaving as I tried and failed to pronounce a single word. I looked broken, pathetic, and utterly vulnerable. Over the video, a voiceover began, Serena's voice filtered to sound like an objective narrator. "Is this the voice you trust? A woman who spent thousands to manufacture a personality, a fraud who hid her instability in Swiss hospitals while her family worked to keep the country informed. Lyra Vance didn't find her voice, she bought a lie." The ballroom fell into a horrified silence. I could see Serena in the shadows of the VIP box, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone, a triumphant smirk on her lips. She had hacked the main feed, intending to expose my weakness at the moment of my greatest strength. She wanted to show the world the stuttering girl, to invalidate the siren. I stood still. I didn't hide my face. I didn't call for security. I watched the video of my own suffering play out on the 40-foot screen. I watched myself struggle, fail, and cry. When the video looped back to the beginning, I stepped closer to the microphone. I didn't wait for the technicians to fix the feed. I used the silence of the room as my canvas. "That girl you see on the screen," I said, my voice echoing through the hall, not with the smoky hum of the siren, but with a raw, piercing honesty that made the air vibrate. I pointed at the giant image of my younger, struggling self. "That girl spent 20 years in a prison made of your expectations. She was told that her struggle was a shame, that her silence was a defect. Serena thinks she is exposing a fraud, but she is actually showing you the foundation of everything I am. I didn't buy this voice. I earned it through every tear you see on that screen. I fought for every syllable, every breath, and every truth I now speak." I turned my gaze directly toward the VIP box where Serena sat. "My sister thinks that being broken makes you unfit to lead. She thinks that perfection is the only frequency that matters. But the world isn't perfect. The world is stuttering. The world is struggling to find its breath in a sea of lies. I am the siren not despite that girl on the screen. I am the siren because of her." The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of awe. A single person in the front row began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet again, the applause louder than before, this time not for the CEO, but for the survivor. The screens suddenly went black as my security team finally regained control of the system. But the damage, Serena's damage, was already undone. By trying to humiliate me, she had humanized me. She had given my brand the one thing the Vances never had, an unbreakable soul. I finished my speech to a roar that shook the glass chandeliers. As I walked off stage, I saw Serena being escorted out by 2 guards. She looked small, her face twisted in a mask of disbelief. She had used her last bullet, and it had turned into a crown for the person she hated most. I went back to my dressing room and sat in the quiet. I picked up the golden trophy and looked at my reflection in its polished surface. I didn't see the siren. I didn't see the architect. I saw Lyra. "We did it," I whispered to the empty room, and for the first time, the words felt like they didn't just belong to the airwaves. They belonged to me. The final battle for the Vance legacy was over. There was only one thing left to do: return to where it all began and close the final door on the past.
A year has passed since the night Serena tried to burn my reputation and only succeeded in lighting my coronation fire. The Vance Tower has been rebranded as The Signal, and its philosophy is simple. We don't broadcast to the people. We provide the technology for the people to broadcast themselves. The Clearwater District now has the cleanest water in the state, funded by the reparations I clawed back from my father's offshore accounts. But the biggest change happened in the limestone mansion. I bought it from the auction block, stripped the heavy curtains and the mahogany isolation, and turned it into the Echo Center, a world-class facility for speech therapy and communication arts. The attic, where I once whispered into a broken microphone, is now a high-tech lab where children learn that a stutter isn't a defect, but a unique rhythm. I sat in my office at the tower, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. My desk was clear, except for a single golden microphone, the first one my grandfather ever used. "Miss Vance?" My producer's voice crackled in my ear. "It's time for the anniversary broadcast. The lines are jammed. Everyone wants to talk to the siren tonight." "Open the lines," I said, leaning into the mic. I didn't need the dark filters anymore. My voice was mine, resonant, calm, and effortlessly clear. "Good evening," I told the millions listening. "1 year ago, I stood on a stage and showed you my broken pieces. Tonight, I want to hear yours. This is a night for the unheard. If you've spent your life in the shadows of someone else's noise, the air is yours. Who's our first caller?" There was a long pause, a heavy silence that felt different from the technical glitches of the past. It was a human silence, hesitant and fragile. "Caller, you're on the air," I encouraged softly. "Lyra?" The voice was a ghost. It was thin, trembling, and stripped of all its former baritone majesty. It was Silas. The studio grew cold. My producer looked at me through the glass, his hand hovering over the cut button. I shook my head. "I'm here, Silas." I didn't call him father. That title had been revoked by the truth. I called to say, I watched the news today," he whispered. He was speaking from a small, one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city he used to refuse to drive through. "The Echo Center. It's beautiful. You put the library in the archives. You made the basement a garden." "I made the basement a place where people could grow, Silas, not where they could be hidden."
I spent my life thinking that the world only listened to the strongest signal, Silas said, and I could hear the sound of a glass clinking, likely the cheap scotch that was now his only companion. But looking at you, hearing you, I realized I was the one who was silent all along. I had nothing to say, so I just made noise. Is there a question, Silas, or did you just call to audit your regrets? A long sigh came through the speakers. No questions. I wanted to hear it one more time, without the filter, just your voice. It's the only thing in this city that sounds like the truth. The truth was always there, Silas, I said, my voice softening with a pity that finally replaced the rage. I hope you find some peace in the quiet, because the quiet is where you finally find yourself. I disconnected the call. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle was closed. The man who had tried to mute me ended up seeking refuge in the very voice he despised. I turned back to the microphone. The lines were lighting up, thousands of them, people with stutters, people with accents they had been told to hide, people with stories that had been buried under the Vance authority for decades. "This is Lyra Vance," I said, a smile spreading across my face as I looked at the city lights, "and the airwaves are officially open. Tell me, what have you been waiting to say?" As the voices began to pour in, a chaotic, beautiful, stuttering, and magnificent symphony of human experience, I leaned back and just listened. For 20 years I had waited for my turn to speak, but I realized now that the greatest power of a voice isn't in being heard, it's in the ability to give that silence to someone else and wait, with love, for them to find their own rhythm. The static was gone, the signal was eternal, and for the first time in history, the world wasn't just loud, it was finally, truly speaking.